From coast to coast, the Pac-12 to the SEC and every conference in between, Stoney Keeley and Stephen McCash break down all the action from the week that was in college football, react to the AP Top 25 poll, talk Heisman race, and dive into all of the most interesting lines of the week based on what the odds makers are saying in the SEC and on the national scale. This is the College Football Roundup on Sobros Network.
Welcome back for a brand new episode of the College Football Roundup right here on Sobros Network. Minds right, asses tight, as we tackle episode 9 of the 2024 season for you today. It's a big episode, and we've got a lot to talk about. I couldn't do it without the utility man of Sobros Network, my co-host for College Football Roundup. He is Mr. Stephen McCash. McCash, how you doing today, my man?
Man, I could sit here and complain, but this podcast would take on a whole different.
We can go down a rabbit hole.
We go down all the rabbits, all the holes, all at once. So I'm actually good, despite the fact here in Memphis it's rainy and dreary, which this day kind of deserves. But that's football weather, baby. So let's talk some football.
Yeah, we have the initial college football rankings. Or the playoff rankings have come out. It's a pretty, I don't know. I was kind of expecting a bigger surprise, usually a disparity between the committee and the AP, but for the most part, I think they're in some different orders, but it's not quite that outrageous. So we're going to be talking about the rankings. We're going to be looking ahead to this week's action. If you are watching us live on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, hop in the comments. Let us know what you think about the initial college football playoff rankings. Let us know what you're thinking about this week's matchups as well. So, McCash, let's go through it. The rankings straight up, 1 through 12. You have Oregon, Ohio State, Georgia, Miami. I couldn't read my own handwriting there. I was like, who is Wah? Texas, Penn State, Tennessee, Indiana, BYU, Notre Dame, Alabama, and then Boise State right there at 12. First of all, any surprises to you with the top 12 teams, or did they at least get the right 12 teams in your mind?
I would maybe argue one team at this point, but
okay.
My biggest gripe is Boise being at 12.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. Them and Notre Dame should be swapped just on the top of things. Boise's one loss is a 3-point loss to the number 1 team.
Yeah.
While Notre Dame's one loss is to Northern Illinois, who I think's only won like 3 games at this point of the year, maybe 4 at this point of the year. They're not even going to be. I don't think they'll make it a bowl. And you've got them as the number 10 team. Come on. And I'm pro Notre Dame.
Yeah, I think that one. So who do you put in over Notre Dame then?
I'm not necessarily knowing I'm taking them out of the top 12.
Oh, okay.
If I was, it would be SMU.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they're on the outside looking in on this. Any gripes with Oregon being the top team in the country right now?
I can't really complain. They haven't been a dominant team the whole year, but they've been consistent the whole year.
Yeah. Well, it was a situation that I feel like those first couple of weeks for Oregon, we kind of felt like, hey, this is not the Oregon Ducks that we thought were going to run roughshod over college football. They struggled with, I can't remember, an FCS school, and then a 10-point win in week 2 as well. But then they seemed to kick it into another gear when we got into late September, October, and they have started to look like that team that we thought they would be after I think it was after that game to Boise State when they squeaked that one out 37-34. Then they start kind of looking like the Oregon Ducks we thought they would be. I think Dylan Gabriel's kind of making a late push to be included in the Heisman conversation. Now, after that victory over Ohio State, I think they're the undisputed number 1 team in the country, in my opinion. And it's just a matter of, at this point, closing out the season, just finish what you started kind of deal. I think it doesn't take long. We get to number 2 on this list right after the Oregon Ducks. I think you could take some issue with Ohio State being ranked number 2 there ahead of the Georgia Bulldogs and even ahead of the Miami Hurricanes at this point. I think both of those teams have a legitimate gripe to be ranked ahead of Ohio State. I know Ohio State got the win over Penn State this past weekend, but I just haven't really been too thoroughly impressed with the Buckeyes. And while Georgia kind of got kicked around by Alabama, I think other than that, they've kind of found their footing, and it's back to business as usual for Georgia. I don't think it's the same Kirby Smart Bulldogs team, but I think they've kind of found their floor in this 2024 season. And Miami, I know people are going to say Miami hasn't really played anybody, but they're rolling people right now. And Cam Ward's electric right now. I think that Georgia and Miami both could have an argument to be ranked ahead of Ohio State. But what do you make of the Buckeyes being there at number 2?
I really don't have a huge gripe about it. Georgia, would benefit at being number 2 right now because they have a big matchup this weekend that could potentially just knock them out of the top 12.
Yeah, I mean, that's we'll talk about that one later on. Georgia heading to Oxford to play Ole Miss, and Ole Miss is a team that I don't think you could say is
it's
dead
completely
quite
out.
yet.
No.
Yeah. So
now,
that's a big one.
And with Ohio State, they still have, obviously they end the year with Michigan. That's going to, no matter how bad either team is, they both step up for that game. So that's a tough one for Ohio State. But the week before, they got Indiana, undefeated.
It's going to be a big one.
That's going to be that's the one I think we'll really see what Indiana is this year.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Then you have Texas right there at number 5. And I don't know, McCash, like, it's a tricky year, and I think once we get past those top 4 teams, I think you can argue just about any of these teams for the college football playoff. Texas, I don't think has been particularly impressive. We saw Penn State do Penn State things over the weekend. They couldn't hold serve against Ohio State. Tennessee has looked a little iffy at times this year. Indiana, the argument is, well, who have they played? BYU is kind of sitting there undefeated in the Big 12, and they're kind of an intriguing team. We've already talked about the issues with Notre Dame, Boise State, and then Alabama already has 2 losses. So this field kind of looks wide open to me. Any surprises of how these teams are ranked right now? Like, I don't know. I think you could pretty easily convince me Indiana should be at number 5 instead of Texas, or BYU should be higher than they are. Like, none of these teams to me feel like they're really putting a stranglehold on a playoff spot is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's not like years past where you have a dominant 1-2 sitting at the top, and going into the 14 playoff from years past, that those were 2 of the 4 or 2 or all 4 of those teams. I think if you go Miami to BYU, that 4 through 5, any of those are pretty much interchangeable at this point.
Yeah.
If you were to put Tennessee at 5, I wouldn't have really been too upset about it, or if BYU or Indiana was even further. I am a little surprised that Alabama is the 1-2 loss team that's made the top 12. And I think a lot of that is just name recognition alone at this point, because
which 2-loss team goes in over them, or just no 2-loss team at all.
You've got a team like SMU, which I would switch in at this point, because SMU's only loss is a 3-point loss early in the season to an undefeated BYU team.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. SMU does have a pretty compelling case there. What do you think the state of the ACC has to say about that? Because right now you're looking at Miami being the only representative from that conference in. Clemson suffers a pretty bad loss to Louisville. SMU's on the outside looking in. Pitt was handed their first loss recently. I mean, does this kind of feel like it's Miami or bust for you, or do you think SMU has a real shot? I mean, they're going to have to probably run the table to get in, but does this look like a one representative conference to you right now?
At this point, yes, but with SMU scheduled, they don't really play anybody the rest of the year. They got Boston College next. They're on a bye this week. They go Boston College at Virginia, and then they finish with Cal coming across pretty much half the country again.
Damn. Yeah,
poor Bears. But if they win out, that puts them at 8-0 in the conference. Miami, I assume, would run course as well, and they would meet up in the ACC championship. Miami's sitting there as what, the number 4 team.
Yeah.
So if if Georgia loses, they move up. If Ohio State loses, they move up. So Miami could potentially be the number 2 team in the rankings when it's all said and done, going to the ACC championship, and then lose to SMU. And who knows where they and then what? Yeah. Do you get 2 ACC teams in at that point?
I that's interesting to think about, but I think, do you think it's safe to say, at least at this point, the way Clemson looked against Louisville, that it's down to 2 ACC teams competing for a playoff spot potentially?
Absolutely. Despite how Clemson performed after that Georgia loss opening the season, I still didn't fully believe in Clemson, and they did what Penn State does, and they just shit the bed at the right time of the year.
What hope do you have for Penn State to kind of turn this thing around, or is it good enough for them to just kind of ride this thing out and maybe get into the playoff and see what happens then? But this team just seems like under James Franklin, it's a program that is just completely allergic to competing for Big Ten championships.
I mean, if it's luckily the rest of the year they don't play a team ranked at all, let alone in the top 10. So as long as they're not playing anybody in the top 10, they're magic. They'll be good. They're fine.
They're hoping Indiana and Oregon win out and meet in the Big Ten championship, because then it means Penn State does not have to compete in the Big Ten championship in a game that they would probably lose and effectively end their playoff hopes altogether. I mentioned Indiana there, and I'm kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are on it, or as Jake in the comments calls them, Indiana, America's team right now. The 9-0 Hoosiers, the first time in program history they've gotten to that mark. The fighting Kurt Signetti's, that man has done a fantastic job. Curtis Rourke at quarterback, man in the system there. They're looking pretty good right now, but I think there's a fair argument that they haven't exactly played the stiffest of competition just yet. They were one of the teams, Indiana and BYU, that I felt when the rankings came out could be a surprise omission from the top 12. Because even though the AP is really high on them because they're both undefeated, historically we've seen the committees get together and really weight the level of competition and kind of push some of these teams like Indiana and BYU on down the rankings. But kind of relieved to see that they're in the list. But at this point, man, who would have thought the initial college football playoff rankings were going to come out and the Indiana Hoosiers would be one of the 12 teams in? It certainly wasn't me. Probably one of the best stories in college football this season. But what do you think about their schedule the rest of the way, McCash? And is this a team that can get the job done, close this out, and end up as one of the 12 teams in the playoff?
Well, they took their first real test of the year last week against Michigan State because they hadn't trailed at all for a single second this season. And then they quickly went down 10-0 and in the first quarter, and were down 10-0 after one, and then rolled off 47 straight points to finish off the Spartans 47-10. Can they do it again? Because they've got Michigan this week. Luckily, it's in Bloomington, so they'll have the home field advantage, and those Hoosiers will be going crazy. But then they get a bye week, luckily, to prepare for Ohio State, but that's at Columbus. So they've got 2 tough games, despite Michigan being down this year. That's still a tough game for these Hoosiers, and then to follow it up with Ohio State before they take on Purdue. I do not think they will finish the year undefeated, but I still think their resume and what they've done this season will be good enough to keep them in that top 12.
It's crazy to think, like, it's starting to creep in. For the last several weeks, I've thought, okay, well, Indiana's going to meet a buzzsaw at some point, and that bubble's going to burst for Hoosiers fans. But the last couple of weeks I've watched Indiana and thought the possibility of doubt is creeping into my mind. Like, could they beat Ohio State? And I don't think that's something any of us would have said before the season started. but where this team is at right now, I don't think I'm going to be surprised by anything that Indiana does anymore.
No. And think of that. So let's say Ole Miss beats Georgia. That gives Georgia 2 losses. And then Indiana does beat Ohio State, 2 losses there. And then Indiana and BYU and say Tennessee and other teams like that with the 1 loss or no losses continue to win. Will we get to a point that at the end of the year where we have a 12-team playoff that doesn't have Alabama, Georgia, or Ohio State? Is that feasible?
That would be crazy. I mean, I can see Alabama not getting in wholeheartedly, but for all 3 of them, I mean, there's a path for that. There's a scenario for that, and that's interesting to think about right there. Going down the list, we've got BYU at 9. We've kind of talked about the Big 12 race a little bit on this show before and how it's just wide open. I don't think any of us saw BYU being undefeated at this point in the season, but again, here we are. And the Big 12 just doesn't really look like it's going to be the race that we thought it would be. Right now, we've got BYU, we've got Iowa State in this thing, and we still have Colorado in this thing. This is going to be an interesting race to watch. I think you've brought it up on this show before, McCash, but if the Big 12 is not careful, and if BYU doesn't just run the table here, they could end up losing the first round bye to Boise State, because I do think Boise State's going to end up running the table. They're really fucking good this year.
Yeah, they are.
So what's your read on the Big 12 race right now? Does BYU have to basically run the table to get a bye at this point?
Oh, absolutely. Because the only way that Boise is going to slip up and lose again is in the Mountain West Championship when they will more than likely will take on UNLV again in a rematch.
Yeah, and that was a tough game for Boise too. I mean, UNLV played their style of defense matched up pretty well with Boise State. They held Ashton Genty in check for the first half of that game, and when it got into the third and fourth quarter, Boise started to pull away.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't see Boise at this point losing. And as much as it pains me, my Memphis Tigers are nowhere near the conversation anymore after last
2
week.
losses.
Yeah, so we're not even going to discuss that. So obviously, unless Boise just shits the bed completely these last few weeks of the season, they're going to be the Group of 5 representative. And really, whether they get a bye that first or has to be in the 5-12 situation, I think they can get a win in this playoffs. I'm not saying they're going to be national champions, but like they're projected right now, they would face Ohio State as the 5-12.
Yeah.
Ohio State's not stopping that running game.
No, I don't think so. And I mean, we've seen this Boise State team prove it against the number 1 team ranked in the country. Like, they can hang with some of these guys. So it's a very dangerous team. I think the one interesting thing, I go back to something that you talked about on the very first episode of this season. 2 Group of 5 teams getting into the playoff. And I think there's a scenario where
there is. I think I know where you're going.
If Penn State drops another game, if Indiana loses a couple of games, if Alabama loses again, Notre Dame, there are a lot of these teams that are kind of iffy right now. What do you do if Boise State runs the table here and then the Black Knights of Army continue running the table? Because they're 8-0 at this point, if I'm not mistaken.
They're undefeated. Yeah, I don't know.
They're undefeated. What do we do?
And they have
here?
Notre Dame coming up.
Yeah, so that's a direct opportunity to knock Notre Dame out of the playoff race. I mean, I know it's not. I know the rule is the top 5 conference champions, and then everybody else is sorted after that. But I do think there's a world where BYU loses a game or 2, and Penn State loses again. Indiana, Notre Dame, Alabama. There's several teams here. I don't personally think Texas has been as good as we expected them to be since the beginning of the season. There's a scenario where I think some of these teams could start falling down the rankings, and as Army keeps winning, they could get up to that 12 spot. And I know it feels like one of those things that the committee will try to prevent from happening, but that's the timeline I want to see. I want to see Army in the playoff.
The best way this happens is Boise and Army go through the regular season undefeated.
Yeah.
Army then goes in probably to face either Navy or Tulane in the AAC championship game. They win that game, beat Navy the following week. So they are a group of 5 undefeated champion. Then Boise, because they've continued to win and teams above them are losing, they continue to climb, but then Boise loses to UNLV. So then Army becomes the group of 5 rep, but because Boise lost a close game to UNLV, and let's say Genty doesn't play in that game, so the committee can't really hold this loss against them like they did Florida State last year when Daniels was out.
Yeah.
So at this point, Boise doesn't fall that far in the top 12 rankings. They're still in that top 12, and that's how you get Army and Boise. I was right all along. I just had one of the teams wrong.
Yeah, you had Memphis in the spot, not Army. Yeah. Eddie chiming in the comments, Vandy got disrespected hard, not in the top 25. I haven't even looked at the rest of the 25. I just looked at the top 12 preparing for this show.
Missouri is at 24th, and Missouri did beat Vanderbilt. So it's hard for me, to give a team to put Vandy above Missouri. Missouri has one less loss than Vandy does, and they beat them head to head. So
head to head. Well, who's at 25? That's the question.
Army. That's Army.
Army. Yeah, I'm not going to put them in over Army, but
I think Army should be a little higher than 25.
I do too. Yeah. Oh, Louisville got back in.
Yep.
Louisville got
Army's
back in.
19th in the coaches poll, and Army is 18th in the AP poll. So I was assumed they would be in that 20 range.
Yeah.
That 18 to 20 range, because you got Colorado, Louisville, Clemson, and Missouri, all teams with 2 and 3 losses ahead of them. Granted, Army really hasn't played anybody.
Yeah.
But they've destroyed pretty much everybody that's been in front of them.
Man, listen, I like what John Mateer has done for Washington State, their quarterback, but that is a phony ass 7-1 record. I just gotta say, you watch Washington State play, and their one loss was just getting blown out by Boise State. But I don't know how I feel about Washington State. Like, you put those two teams on a neutral field, I'm going Vanderbilt 9 out of 10 times probably. So I get the feelings, but yeah, I don't think you can put them ahead of Mizzou right now, and I'm not putting them ahead of Army.
Now, granted, I don't think Missouri should even be in it, but that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah. Any thoughts on Notre Dame or Alabama that we haven't said before we move on to the bracket?
No, I mean, Alabama, LSU this weekend. That's a loser leaves playoff contention.
It is. It's a big game. So the bracket for this thing, because it's not just lined up 1 through 12. The top 4, the highest 4 ranking conference champions get buys. Right now, that would be Oregon, Georgia, Miami, and BYU getting the buys. That would leave number 5, Ohio State, taking on number 12, Boise State, Indiana versus Tennessee, Alabama versus Texas, and Notre Dame versus Penn State in a game that who's going to choke in that one? Damn. If they're both choke artists, who's going to choke that one away?
It's going to be a tie.
Yeah, it'll be a tie. What do you make of actually seeing this process that we've heard so much about? We're finally getting to see it come to life a little bit with a tangible bracket we can look at and say, this is what the 12-team playoff looks like. What do you think of it in its first iteration?
I love these matchups. If this first round was to happen in real life, I would be ecstatic as a football fan. Indiana at Tennessee just sounds like a 90s, a late 80s, early 90s, just like gridiron classic.
Yeah.
Alabama, Texas, same way. I mean, it's just those 3 games with the Notre Dame and Penn State matchup. That's 6 iconic programs in college football history, and it excites me to see Indiana back and relevant again. But the one that I really like would be Boise State versus Ohio State, because I truly think Boise State could get that win, and then that winner gets BYU.
Yeah,
Boise would smoke BYU.
Yeah, there's a path there. There's a path there for the Boise State Broncos to go on a run here. I do think they could beat Ohio State, and I feel like that sounds crazy, but
Yeah.
I go back to just not being particularly impressed for all of the talent that Ohio State has. I still don't think they've really put it together. And maybe that's the thing that makes them dangerous, is that we can flip that and kind of say, well, if they do flip that switch, this Buckeyes team is in a position to go on a run. I think the Notre Dame Penn State game is the one that you fall asleep to, but you know what? We'll see. We'll see. The Alabama Texas matchup, I think, is really interesting. Brand recognition, name value sort of thing, but both of those teams have kind of struggled. So who in that matchup would be able to get right and move on? And then, like you said, the Indiana versus Tennessee matchup, I would love to see that Hoosiers offense, Curtis Rourke at the helm, going up against James Pierce and that Vols defense. That would be pretty compelling television to watch. At the end of the day, where we sit right now, just bottom line, do you think that for the most part they got the rankings right?
Yeah, I can't really argue too much with it. I mean, I would maybe switch a couple of teams, one or two teams, and then maybe entertain SMU and Alabama being switched.
Okay.
But other than that, no, I think they get pretty much got it right.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think this is the first time that we've gotten these initial playoff release rankings or rankings released that I've kind of thought, yeah, that sounds about right. Usually I feel like they try to do something to stir up the sports talk, like let's put Mississippi State at number 1 or let's put
Right.
Texas A&M in, and people kind of go crazy and talk about it for a couple of weeks on all the sports talk outlets, but doesn't appear to be the case this time. That's a pretty good comprehensive list. I don't know. I think it's interesting to kind of look at this conversation compared to the 14 playoff, where we were having those conversations about 5, 6, 7, maybe having a really compelling case to get the 4th spot, but not getting in. But when you look at it this way, I still just maintain, like, I'm far more comfortable with the conversation being Alabama or SMU than I would be trying to figure out like Miami or Tennessee or that sort of thing. Like, I don't think whichever team between Alabama and SMU is left out is going to have a legitimate shot at a national championship. But if you leave somebody like Tennessee or Texas, if they get right out, like, they've got a gripe. They could win
Yeah.
a national championship. And I think that's still at the heart of this change. And it's what I like about it. And at this point in the season, I think it's important to kind of reevaluate. I would ask those people that said this is going to devalue the regular season if, and I will ask you this directly, McCash, like, if you feel like this expanded playoff has devalued the regular season so far.
Oh no, I think
I'm
it's
with
made
you.
it. I think it's made it more exciting because it's made every game matter. You saw earlier in the season, teams like Tennessee, Ole Miss, and such were playing,
Sure.
Mary Schools of the Blind and whatnot. And normally in the third quarter, they might like pull a bunch of starters, put reserves in and such. But you saw this year they were running up the scores because point
They knew.
differential could be a big factor come at the end of the year. If there was some sort of voting tiebreakers to go in and whatnot, and
For
having those
sure.
bigger margin victories would be, when the voters go back and look, they're like, oh, okay, we saw what they did in the early part of the season. So I would put them over somebody who maybe struggled with a team like that.
Yep, I'm with you wholeheartedly. Well, let's move ahead. Let's talk about this week's action coming up. I want to start with the South Carolina Vandy game because I was kind of surprised to see this line. The Gamecocks are favored by 3.5 traveling to Nashville. I don't know. I still feel like there's a little Jekyll and Hyde about this South Carolina team, and I know they're capable of going out there and just whooping up on a good Texas A&M team. And I know that Vanderbilt has been a little shaky at times this season. You mentioned the Mizzou game earlier. That Georgia State game looks pretty bad in hindsight. The narrow loss to Texas at this point, but I still feel like this Vanderbilt team that's now bowl eligible after beating Auburn, I still feel like this Vanderbilt team is capable of handling South Carolina. And if this number was around like 2.5, maybe it's a different conversation, but 3.5 over a field goal. I don't know how I feel about this one, McCash. Do you lean a certain way in this matchup?
Oh, absolutely. I feel Vandy at this point of the season is being greatly disrespected by Vegas. They
Yeah,
were what, a 7-point underdog last week to Auburn,
Auburn.
and they
Yeah,
won by 10 outright. I don't want
only
any
allowed
points.
7 points.
I don't want any points. Give me Vandy straight up, because I think this team isn't happy just being bowl eligible.
Yeah, I
They
would
want
agree.
more. They are not going to look past Carolina. I think they'll take care of business at home. I think the Commodore fans are really starting to embrace this team. You've seen their crowds be much better because normally it's a sea of the opposing team. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's
Mhm.
still not, but the Vandy fans that are showing up are very vocal this year. They want to get that seventh win. And look, they got LSU and Tennessee left. And if they want to do big things, this is going to be their opportunity.
Yeah, I'm with you. They can't let this one slip. So I'm man, I'm going with Vandy on this one.
I do
And
too.
it feels like bait to me, and I don't know how the betting public looks at this. Maybe it's a situation where the sports book thinks, oh, after rocking Texas A&M, everybody's going to come in and put money on South Carolina, and then Vandy's going to win.
It's a
But
trap.
locally, having been watched this team, it feels so easily Vanderbilt that I'm like, what does Vegas know? Is this the situation where we bet Vandy and then South Carolina wins big? So I don't know. But I like the Commodores, Diego Pavia playing with heart right now. I like him in this matchup. Florida, um, going to Texas, the Longhorns are favored by 21.5. 4-4 Florida. That I don't know. At times, McCash, they've looked a little better than I expected them to look, but for the most part, this looks like a team that is doing everything that it can to get its coach fired by season's end. Texas desperately needs a get right game to kind of not necessarily, get back in the win column, but just like they've got to start considering these style points, like you mentioned before. Like it hasn't necessarily been pretty for Texas. What do you think they can do against the Florida Gators? Can they cover that 21.5 point number?
Absolutely, very easily. So, Florida, unfortunately, is in the midst of a murderer's row in their schedule.
Yeah, it ain't
Two
pretty.
2 games ago, they had Tennessee at Tennessee. They lost. They did beat Kentucky. Big deal. They had Georgia last week, Texas this week, then LSU, then Ole Miss.
Brutal.
I mean, if they can win one of those remaining three, if they can go 1-2 in those three, and then obviously they're going to beat Florida State at the end of the year because Florida State is Florida State this year.
Yeah.
That would
Mhm.
make Florida bowl eligible.
That's crazy.
I don't
It
think it's going to happen.
does not look like a bowl eligible team.
No. So if Florida becomes bowl eligible by the grace of God, does Napier keep his job?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. I kind of feel like they're ready to throw him off the ship, man.
I thought they would have by now.
Yeah. I feel this is a spot where I think I'm backing Texas as well. I feel like there's got to be some sentiment in that building. Like we've got to start getting this thing going, and
Yeah.
I think they're going to come out guns a blazing.
I think, and we'll probably talk about this with other teams as well. Like, if we talk about Tennessee and Alabama, obviously, but these teams that are in the top 12, they have to be, laser focused the rest of the season, knowing that
Sure.
there's no room for error at this point of the season. I think you're going to see this Texas team come out, really well prepared and take care of business this week.
Did not think that Colorado versus Texas Tech would be a game we'd be talking about on the show on November 6th, but here we are. Both of these teams are still technically in the Big 12 race. I mean, Colorado's in the top 25. Given the state at the top of the Big 12, I don't think we should be counting the Buffaloes out right now. They are 3.5 point favorites going to Texas Tech, who has been a little Jekyll and Hyde themselves this season so far. Lubbock, Texas, we've seen some crazy things happen out there. Can the Red Raiders pull off this upset, McCash?
I think they can, but I just think Colorado is just playing too well right now.
It's clicking
Uh,
for them.
I'm shocked that Prime has this team playing as well as they are this late in the season.
Yeah.
And that their key players aren't injured because of how much some of them play.
I know.
So, yeah, I got to lean towards Colorado getting the job done and covering. Granted, it's on the road, but I got to lean towards the Buffaloes.
I like it. I'm with you. Get some electric plays in there on offense. Another game I did not think we'd be talking about on November 6th. We have Army going to North Texas. Big game in the American Conference. Army is favored by 5.5. North Texas has played some good ball at times this season, but what do you make of this number?
Look, I can't believe this number is this low. North Texas, yeah, they're sitting 5-3, and they gave Memphis all they could handle. They fought hard with Tulane as well last week, but man, give me Army minus the 5.5 all day.
So what you're saying is we can expect that Army pick and tank the 401k this week, huh?
Oh yeah, that'll be one of my 5. Absolutely.
I'm with you. I mean, I know I respect Denton, Texas going on the road. Maybe it's a tough place to play. I don't know, but the way that Army is running the ball right now, and the way that their quarterback, whose name escapes me, of course, and when I need it,
Daly,
Bryson Daly,
yeah,
Bryson Daly,
something like that.
Bryson Daly's making plays, scoring multiple touchdowns every game. Give me Army and give me the points. Miami, here's an interesting one. 11-point favorites on the road at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech, a team that kind of started hot, climbed into the top 25 of the AP poll, has since tapered off a little bit. That's the word I'm looking for. Still kind of a feisty, maybe a spicy team. We've seen Miami kind of struggle at times playing down to competition. It was close against Virginia Tech, and we've seen them kind of allow teams to hang around for a little bit. Is there a path to an upset for the Yellow Jackets here, McCash, or do you expect Cam Ward and company to handle business as usual?
Well, we've seen every week this year a double-digit underdog has won outright at some point every Saturday, or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Every day we play college football now. So yeah, there's a possibility, because this is going to be one of those big underdog matchups. But I just think, like I talked about with Texas earlier in their matchup, Miami is going to be laser focused. Cam Ward is going to. He had a couple of mistakes in the last couple of games he's played with interceptions, but I think Miami runs roughshod over Georgia Tech, and I think Georgia Tech only got a lot of the accolades that they did early in the season because of that Florida State win when we thought Florida State was good.
Yeah, a top 10 team, no less. Yeah. Elsewhere in the ACC, another interesting one. Virginia Tech has been a disappointment this year, no doubt about that. They are hosting the Clemson Tigers, the wounded Clemson Tigers, coming off of that beat down from the hands of Louisville. Clemson favored by 6.5 in this one. I think if you look at the records, if you look at where these two teams are at, you'd probably say that's Clemson easily. But man, Virginia Tech has a lot of talent. And I'm not saying there's going to be an upset here, but I think this is a game that if Clemson doesn't bounce back, then they're going to be in trouble in Blacksburg in this one. What do you make of that 6.5-point number?
I would feel much better if it was 7.5. If it was 7.5, I would definitely take Virginia Tech at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Louisville loss last week for Clemson is going to be resonating still, because they know that pretty much knocked them out of any chance for the playoffs.
Yeah,
and really hurt their chances of getting back into the ACC championship game, despite only really being out one game. I lean towards Virginia Tech covering this with a slight chance of pulling the upset.
We've talked about BYU as an unexpected undefeated at this point in the season. They're going to Utah, and this looks like a Utah team that is reeling right now. They're 4-4. They haven't played up to standards. There's been a lot of injuries, but man, this is not the playoff team that we thought this would be. These guys were the Big 12 favorites heading into the season. Is there any of that magic left? Is there any of that mystique left for Utah, for one of the greatest environments in college football to play? is there any juice left in this program to pull off the upset against an undefeated BYU team and spoil their playoff pursuit?
Absolutely not. And let me sit here, 8 weeks into the season, 9 weeks. Utah was one of my 12-team playoffs teams. So I don't look so great on that pick.
Well, at least you didn't pick Virginia Tech as one of your teams.
No, I did not. But with that said, Utah's lost 4 in a row, and for the most part, they've been close games, but I don't feel like they've been really close games.
Fair
The
enough.
scores have been close, but I just think the opponents have dominated from start to finish. With that said, I'm shocked this line is as low as it is. So, like the Army game, you can chalk that up for the 401k as well. BYU by 1 million.
Yeah, the number is 4. I don't know if I actually said that or not, but the Cougars are favored by 4 at Utah. Interesting game in the Big 12 race. In the Big 10 race, Penn State coming off of a loss, having to get right. They are hosting the Washington Huskies. Penn State favored by 13 over a Washington team that has proven to be pretty scrappy at times this season. Do you give them any shot to go to Penn State and keep this one close?
Man, we normally see when Penn State does stub their toe and screws themselves that they bounce back fairly well. And then we see them later in the road, whether it be a bowl game or a conference championship game, they shit the bed again. So I do believe
that's the DNA from the level of competition. Like when they're playing up, they just look like they're not even competitive. But when they're playing teams on their level or below them, they can blow these teams out.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see that this week. We saw what Indiana did to Washington a couple weeks ago, as well as what Iowa did to them as well last month. I think this is a get-right game for Penn State. They know this is the one team really, because if Texas loses again, I still think they could make the 12-team playoff. Penn State loses, there's no coming back for them. So
ball game.
The fact that I think they'll win by the 2 scores, and the fact that the line right now is just under the 2 scores, 2 touchdowns, I'm going to lean towards Penn State in this one.
Yeah, I think the travel being the difference here. Washington has to come across the country to Penn State to play them, and I think that's going to give they're going to be traveling extensively to run into a team that is probably pissed off, wanting to maintain status in the playoff race. And I think they're capable of doing it. This ain't Washington, Michigan. I mean, all due respect to the Wolverines, they're 4-4. This is Penn State. It's different animal kind of deal.
Yep.
Speaking of Michigan, they're traveling to Indiana. This looks like it could be pretty big test for the Hoosiers where they're at right now, but Indiana favored by 2 touchdowns in this one. That number is sitting there at Hoosiers by 14. Michigan, obviously not the national championship caliber team that they were a year ago, but I feel like there's some potential here for Indiana to be on upset alert because of the way that they play defense. And to me, that matchup is going to be the key to the game. How do you read Indiana as 2 touchdown favorites against Michigan, which, by the way, just take that last sentence in, let it soak in for a minute. Indiana favored by 2 touchdowns hosting Michigan.
Yeah, I'm with you on the upset alert. Like I said, every week a double-digit underdog has won. And if this is the one to win this week, it would not shock me at all. Because oh man, Indiana has everything to lose right now because again, they're like Penn State. Granted, they're undefeated, but I do believe if Indiana loses a game in the regular season, they're out of the playoffs.
Well, I just don't think you want to go into that Ohio State game where the expectation is we have to win this one to keep our season alive. Like to me, that's the one I think you could probably lose and still be okay. Because at that point, if Oregon runs the table, Ohio State wins that game, you're likely getting an Oregon-Ohio State rematch for the Big Ten championship, and Indiana's going to be sitting there comfortably at 11-1, can probably still get in.
Yeah.
If you lose to Ohio State, which I think there's a good chance Indiana does, they can beat them. I'm not saying they can. It's a long shot or anything like that. But if they lose that one and they lose to Michigan, well, I think you've just closed the door on the season, because now the narrative is going to be, well, you didn't play anybody for that 9-0 start. So this is a big game for the Hoosiers.
I mean, this is obviously the best team Indiana has played so far.
Yeah.
We've seen what's happened in Nebraska this year. Washington's down. UCLA's down. So this is the toughest competition I think they're going to see so far this year. And we'll really see what this team is made of.
Yeah. I think I'm going to take Michigan plus 14.
I'm with you.
I don't know if they win it outright. I mean, you give the Hoosiers a shot, of course, but I think I'm going to take the Wolverines to hang around in this game because of their defense. Two big matchups in the SEC. I think you could probably say, well, I don't know, Georgia's ranked pretty high, but I think this is probably a couple of de facto elimination games. It definitely is for one of these contests, but for Georgia, man, going to Oxford at Ole Miss, Jackson Dart's been playing pretty well these last couple of games. The Bulldogs favored by 2.5. What an interesting number there, McCash. What do you make of this one?
Well, I'm sitting here as we speak, looking at my phone to see what it would cost me to get in the stadium.
You're right down the road.
Yeah, I'm just 50 minutes away. We are looking, cheapest ticket getting in is about, after taxes and fees at StubHubs, you're looking at about $260 for nosebleed.
Damn.
Yeah.
It's a big game. Big game.
I will be sitting at home watching it on TV. The fact it's a mid-afternoon game kind of makes me think of which way this one would really go. But I got to lean towards Lane Kiffin riding the ship. Jackson Dart has been on fire lately.
Yeah, for sure.
Georgia has bounced back from that Texas loss, but the Alabama loss, excuse me, with the way they handled Texas a couple weeks ago. I really think Georgia's probably going to win, but I am putting all my heart and soul into Ole Miss pulling out the upset.
I think this is going to be the turning point for Lane Kiffin. I think this is going to be the game where they finally break through and they win one of these games against one of the heavyweights in the SEC. Like you said, I think Jackson Dart is playing great right now. I think Georgia has kind of found its way in a sense. I think it's not quite as volatile as it was to start the season, but I think Jackson Dart's playing pretty well right now. I think they're going to go into a hostile environment, and I think Ole Miss is going to pull the upset in this one, and I think it's going to make this college football playoff race pretty damn interesting. But I like Ole Miss in this spot. Alabama, 3-point favorites going to Baton Rouge to take on the LSU Tigers. I'm kind of surprised by that number, McCash. I, as an Alabama fan, am not stoked about the prospects of them going into Death Valley on a Saturday night and pulling off the upset where these two teams are at right now. I understand LSU has a couple of losses, but man, they've looked pretty good at times. I kind of fear this could be the end of the road for Alabama. But what do you think about this matchup?
I'm with you. There's no way in hell I'm betting against drunk Cajuns on a Saturday night. I don't care who they're playing. I really don't.
Yeah.
Alabama has lost 2 of their last 4. Granted they did spank Missouri, but Missouri, I don't care what Missouri's still Missouri. That's further proof. You beat them 34-0. Missouri's still ranked, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yep.
LSU took that loss to LSU to A&M last week, but I think that's going to be another team like Penn State this week who's going to be angry and ready for some redemption, and knowing that, and they both teams going in know that it's loser leave town. Somebody's head's getting shaved, tar and feather, whatever 80s wrestling vernacular you want to use. I like LSU straight up in this one.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. I think LSU comes hot for this one. Well, that's going to do it for us, my man. Unless you have any parting thoughts before we get on out of here.
No, I'm heading to the FedEx Forum for Grizzlies versus Lakers. I'm gonna boo
Nice.
LeBron out of the building.
There you go.
But
who
yeah,
do your Memphis Tigers have this week?
Yeah, we have. I think we have Rice.
Rice.
It's Friday night. It's Friday night. We should win. We have Rice, and then UAB next week. Be for Senior Day, and then we finish the season with Tulane on Thanksgiving.
Hey, don't look now, but if the Blue Raiders can win out, they'll get to a bowl game. They'll get to 6-6. Who do they host this week? They've got Liberty. Now, a couple weeks ago, I would have said it's over. The season's done. But Liberty has looked a little shaky recently, so I don't know. Maybe there's still hope for my Blue Raiders to turn this thing around under Derek Mason.
They're only 11-point underdogs. Maybe Middle Tennessee State is the double-digit underdog champion.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm not going to get my hopes up, though. I'd like to see them win a couple more games this season, but I don't know.
Let's do Vandy versus Middle Tennessee State at the Liberty Bowl.
There we go. Oh my God, I'm there. That would rule so hard. All right, well, that's going to do it for us. He is McCash. I'm Stoney. Subscribe, rate, review wherever you take in your podcast. We are out there in these internet streets, baby. SoBrosNetwork.com for all of our work. And until next week, you stay classy, college